Hey, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, and maybe even good evening to all of you. Welcome to the design session and architects for VCF Private Cloud Fleet. My name is William Lamb. I'm actually joined by my colleague Sushil, along with a whole set of panelists within the VCF Division Solution Architecture team. So let's keep the session lively. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. Feel free to throw them in the Q&A, and our team will help try to get those answered as quickly as possible, right? So here's a quick look at the agenda. We're going to cover the 9.1 architecture. I'm sure you've heard about 9.1, a lot of interest there. And then we're going to take a look at some of the new fleet design and some of the aspects that might impact as you go and deploy your 9.1 infrastructure. And then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Sushil, who's going to talk a little bit about the different ways in which you can reach the different 9.1 pathways. And then obviously we'll conclude with some of the takeaways for you folks all. Okay, let's take a look at the 9.1 architecture. But before we even dive into it, I think it's really important to take a look at kind of where we're at today, right? And it really helps you understand sort of where we're taking the architecture going forward, right? I'm sure many of you have some form of this stack today. And not too long ago, you really helped define and create that software-defined data center, enabling your organization to run, these enterprise workloads, right, at scale. And with all things, right, as you do your job really, really well, the business demand continues to increase, right? And you start to be the needs for more different workloads start to come, which means you need the additional capabilities from logging, auditing, workload mobility, data protection, and recovery. And one of those thankless roles, right, is to keep this infrastructure up and running 24 by 7, right? And the other thing that's unknown to most of the business is all the operational things. That's really a thankless role that you all have been driving, right? Be able to patch and upgrade this infrastructure, making sure that it's running the latest software versions, having the latest security configurations, making sure that you're able to inventory all this infrastructure, password management, providing identity and access control, especially in this day and age, right? With all the concerns around security, ensuring that you've got the latest TLS certificates, right? And it's very complicated to run this for a single deployment in the stack. But as you know, as this infrastructure has grown, you running more and more workloads, that complexity has organically grown over the years. And this becomes certainly a challenge when you start to see these different pieces of infrastructure, right? That might be running different versions of software stack. And yes, some customers still have 6.5 in their environments, right? And that's really where customers are at today. But how do we kind of bring all this infrastructure together and make it simplify in terms of operating it at the most efficient manner possible? And really here, we're trying to help customers go from the existing methodologies in terms of how you're operating this infrastructure and allowing you to modernize that and bringing that modern private cloud experience, which I know many of you are currently on that journey. And what VCF 9 provides is the ability to pull together, not just having visibility into all this infrastructure that might be running in your primary data center, maybe it's at a provider, and even all the way far to the edge, but it allows you to bring in these existing infrastructure, not just the latest version of the software, but your existing versions of that software and providing that available to you for management and configuration. And obviously, this is driven by you as an IT admin, or it could be a service provider. And you're going to be managing this infrastructure, right, in terms of the compute capacity, providing identity management, but also a lot of the fleet lifecycle management that we just showed, right? Patching and upgrade, being able to run automation. And you might do this across a number of different consumption interfaces, whether it's a UI, API, CLI, or even desired state. And we kind of refer to this as building and operating your private cloud. Now, once you have all these resources that you've been pulling together in these different disparate infrastructure environments, I can now bring that up and provide that to typically your line of businesses. And in some cases, you might be the enterprise admin that's actually supporting that. And now you're going to take these resources. Now I can provide additional governance. I can provide standards, taking guest operating systems, turning them into templatized images with your security OS settings, and then surfacing that capability up as enterprise catalog that your end users can then consume. And ultimately, all of this infrastructure that we're talking about, your compute, your storage, your networking, and all the different types of capabilities to run both traditional as well as modern workloads is really to cater to your end customer, right? This could be a typical enterprise end user, right? That might need to have a system provision for, say, a phone service. It can be a developer coming in who may never interact with this infrastructure, right? They might be building applications within their IDE, and they're expecting this infrastructure to be available to them for the different needs, whether they're building an application, whether they're compiling different services, or they're testing the latest and greatest in terms of AI. Or can it be a platform engineering team that becomes that interface between the infrastructure team and your different application teams? And at the end of the day, you want to provide an interface that's what they're used to, right? And be able to create these different workloads, whether it's traditional virtual machines, whether these new AI agentic workloads, or even modern Kubernetes applications. And we typically refer to this as consuming this private cloud. And you take a look at the VCF9 architecture, we really have unified sort of two core interfaces. One is a single console around managing and operating your infrastructure using VCF operations. And the other is a single unified interface for consuming all of this infrastructure, right, in either a single or multi-tenanted environment. Now, I know many of you have VCF operations already deployed in your environment today, right? And historically, you've used this for a couple of reasons, right? Centralized monitoring and troubleshooting, and certainly things for capacity planning and chargeback. Now, as the name suggests, operations is more than just monitoring, right? And we really took this and evolved VCF operations to really become your centralized fleet management interface. And that gives us a number of attributes, right? First and foremost, that lifecycle management that we've talked about, allowing you to not only deploy net new versions of the software, but more importantly, allowing you to bring in all these disparate infrastructure that's been running independently over the years into one single logical inventory that now you can be able to see, understand the versions in software, and be able to roll this out in a centralized manner, right, with consistency. In addition to lifecycle management, we have a whole other set of capabilities. Single sign-on, actual single sign-on now, right, with modern identity, right, whether it's SAML2 or OIDC-based implementation, and allows you to add multi-factor authentication. So now if you wanted to log into this infrastructure with something like a YubiKey, right, to add additional levels of security, you can now do that consistently across every single component within the stack. This was very, very difficult in the past. Certificate management. We're seeing a lot of attacks happen, not because these systems don't have certificates, but they're not using the latest Cypher suite. So again, having this inventory centralized, I can now audit that infrastructure, roll these things out, and in some cases, actually do them in a non-disruptive manner. Same thing with password management. I can now define global policies at various levels of the infrastructure and using your organization's requirements, roll those things out in a very consistent manner. Obviously, with consistent inventory, we're also able to have centralized license management, right? And be able to delegate that at various levels. And you'll see some of that with our 9.1 architecture. And of course, VCF operation continues to provide visibility into capacity planning, chargeback, and also a lot of the security operation, which is top of mind for many of the CIOs and CTOs out there today, right? Especially being able to get the latest patches and understanding which of those are affecting my particular environment. And so I can roll that out with confidence. So from a VCF9 concept standpoint, we obviously have this concept of VCF private cloud. Within this private cloud, we have a VCF fleet. In some cases, many of you might just have a single fleet. And for there's certainly other cases where you might have multiple of these fleets, and we'll talk about some of those considerations there. And within this VCF fleet, I will have something called the VCF instance, right? And then within that, I may have multiple types of domains, and we'll talk about those in a second. So what does this look like starting with 9.0, right? Which is really our first release of this VCF9 architecture, right? If you look at this single fleet instance, right, we start off with VCF operations. Like as mentioned earlier, VCF operation plays a critical role within this new architecture. It becomes this true fleet level service that governs the entire infrastructure that you're managing. And in addition to that, we also have VCF automation, which is sort of tied hip to hip. It's also one of those fleet management capabilities that allows you to, again, take advantage of all that infrastructure, pull that together, and provide consumption interfaces to that infrastructure based on policies and governance. And of course, we have our core SCDC components like vCenter Server, NSX Manager, and SCDC Manager that's responsible for lifecycling all these different components. Now, I can also have workload domains, right? That allows me to separate out these workloads between my management components and my customer workloads. And we'll talk about some of those options that are available there in a second as well. Now, there are some other components that you may or may not be aware of, right? Depending on your hands-on experience with VCF. But we also want to provide identity management, right? And historically, in the 9.0 release, if I wanted to leverage some of the new modern identity capabilities, I would deploy the standard VMware Identity Broker Appliance. This came as a 3-node cluster, right? So if I needed identity across my stack, I would deploy this component that gave me that capability. But these would be 3 separate virtual machines, obviously for high availability purposes. And I didn't have a choice if I wanted to have sort of a single node deployment or not. I also have VCF operations for log, formerly known as vRealize logs or log insight for those timers out there. And I can deploy a single instance of this to provide logging capabilities. Now, if I want a high availability, I will have to deploy some additional nodes there, right? And typically most of you would, especially for scale. And then we also have another component called VCF Operations Fleet Manager. This was also similar to the vRealize Lifecycle Manager. So if you're running VCF 5.x, you would have a different variation of this appliance there that provides some other capabilities. So net, this is kind of what a 9.0 fleet looks like today. Now, that was just a single fleet, single instance. I can certainly have additional instances deployed, and the stack will look very similar. But you'll see that we do have additional appliances that you may deploy for different reasons, right? Whether I want to have 2 different identity providers for my infrastructure, if I want to have additional logging capabilities. But all within the fleet, you can see we are having to deploy multiple of these virtual appliances, right? And while in 9.0, what we did was really unified experience from a UI standpoint, the underlying appliances were mostly left as is, right, as part of that transition. Now, you probably heard a lot about this new VCF management services. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how does this influence this new architecture and sort of what its purpose in terms of this 9.1 change here. So what's new with 9.1? So you'll see on the right-hand side, it looks very similar to what we have started with the 9.x architecture. But a big change here, obviously, is a couple of new components that we are introducing in 9.1. The first is a new license server component. This is a small virtual machine, 2x4 vCPU. And this was really introduced to provide additional flexibility for some of those customers who need to deploy license entitlement system that's closer to some of their deployments, which may be further out at the edges location. We only need one deployment of this component. However, you do have flexibility for some customers who might have different lines of businesses with different types of entitlements, and I need to have hard partitioning. And again, some cases the latency might be too great where I need to place this closer to the components that are being entitled. So we do have some flexibility there. Second one is this new VCF management services. This is a modernized Kubernetes application. And its role is actually to now transition and consolidate a number of appliances that we had left there 9.0, right? So one of the things that we pulled in is this identity broker capability. It's now part of VCF management service out of the box. Same with VCF operations for log. This is now referred to as log management, right? So now instead of having to deploy a separate set of appliances, which means another set of OSs, another set of interfaces for lifecycle management, and now have that completely unified within a modern Kubernetes system. We're also pulling both the VCF operations fleet manager. So if you're deploying 9.0, that was a component that was providing some lifecycle management for the management components. Now, if you're coming from VCF 5.x, right, we also have the vRealize lifecycle manager. So that's yet another appliance, right? So you might have multiple of these running in your current infrastructure, and going into 9.1, as you start to unify the versioning, you now have a single place for all these different functionality. And to furthermore, to talk a little bit about the features, we've also been pulling a number of capabilities from the SCDC manager component into VCF management services. So this is really an evolution of the VCF 9 architecture. And like I said, in 9.0, we pulled in all the existing appliances that create that unified experience. However, we have left the appliances. A lot of that was for backwards compatibility purposes, right? For customers who might be using, say, SCDC manager APIs, we did not want to disrupt that, right? But you'll see over time, we're going to start to consolidate and collapse these resources into this unified control plane that is a modern interface for that. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of ways in which I can deploy the VCF management services. I can start with a simple deployment known as a non-HA configuration. And here we have a couple of options, right? Obviously, I have 2 components as part of this application stack. I have something called a control plane node. You can think of this as like vCenter, right? It's the brains of the system. I then have these worker nodes, right? And as the name suggests, these are going to be the component that runs the different applications and services on top of that. You can think of the worker nodes sort of like your ESX host, right? Now, one nice property of Kubernetes, right, especially from a worker node standpoint, is if I lose one of these nodes, automatically, it's going to automatically heal itself and go ahead and deploy an additional worker node and automatically replace that, right? And these worker nodes can scale out based on the different services you're going to enable. And there are some default services here, like the identity broker, lifecycle management services we had talked about already. But there are some additional services that you can turn on as a day-end operation, right? So I can scale out. I might actually scale up, right? Because if I'm adding more of these services on top of it, these worker nodes might need to be sized up to the next t-shirt sizes. Historically, you would have to kind of shut everything down as a virtual appliance, find the t-shirt sizes, and go and reconfigure those virtual machines, and then power them back up. Using a modern approach, it automatically does that automatically for you in this kind of rolling upgrade scenario, right? So there's no disruption to the application. And in some cases, it might even scale down, right? If I'm not requiring those resources, right? And that's done automatically for you as part of this platform. Now, as the name suggests, this is a non-highly available solution, meaning if the control plane goes down, right? Obviously, we have things like vSphere HA that will automatically restart the virtual machine. But if for whatever reason I lost the host that was running the VM, or maybe I had data corruption, obviously you might get into a recovery situation. So alternatively, we can also deploy the VCF management services in a highly available configuration. And as you would expect, I have my worker nodes and I have 3 control plane nodes. Now I can lose either control plane nodes or worker nodes. And again, automatically, a nice property of the modern system is that it's automatically going to go and recover and making sure that the system is fully resilient from that standpoint. As mentioned earlier, we can also deploy additional services. So that log management capability that I talked about earlier, it is an optional capability, right? One of the nice features of it is it automatically wires up all of the management components, sends all of its logs to the log management system, and it's fully integrated into VCF operations. So now I have one single place, see all those logs, and as I deploy additional instances, workload domains, if log management is configured, it'll automatically set up those log forwarding for you automatically. So as I deploy these additional services, including like real-time metrics, it's going to automatically deploy additional worker nodes if required. Okay, so what are some of the networking models that supported with VCF management services? I know there's been a little bit of confusion around what's supported out there and some of the things you might see that's in our UI. And there are some additional advanced settings that you can use depending on your particular requirements, right? The first one is, sharing a single management network. This is something many of our customers do today for simplicity purposes. You're running things like vCenter, NSX managers on this management network. I can actually put these additional fleet services on there, whether it's VCF operations, automation, as well as the VCF management services, right? Keeps things very simple, especially if I have additional IP addresses available within this management network, whether it's a greenfield deployment or maybe an environment that you're upgrading from an existing infrastructure. Second option is I can certainly split this off and have these fleet services deployed onto a dedicated VCF management network, right? This might be a VLAN-backed network that you had just created, or it might just be one that's available for you, that you have available IPs. I can also deploy that, right? So these are kind of the two primary models in which I can deploy this. And there's a few other ones you could actually look at within the design blueprints within the technical documentation. Now, often a question comes up is sort of, well, what are the IPs that I actually need? What are the FKNet requirements? So let me help clarify some of those misconceptions here, right? Ultimately, when you think about VCF management services, what we're really trying to do is allow it to be the management of all these different scenarios where I need to scale up, out, potentially in. As I add new services, I don't want to be bothered having to provide those IP addresses. And if you take a look at a traditional way of provisioning net new services or virtual appliances, I got to go to the networking team. I got to go ask for some FQDNs. I got to go ask for some IP addresses. And depending on how you're buffering that out, you might have to go to the team multiple times. And the key difference between the VCF management services is that it itself is now the IPAM system, right? I just give it a set of IP addresses. And this is how a modern Kubernetes system works, right? Is I give it a set of IPs. It's going to go and automatically manage it for me based on my demand and load. So if you look at this example here, automatically the UI would default to the management network. So for example, we have this 10.10.0.24 network, and we need a block of IP addresses. So let's say we're starting at 10.10.0.20, and we're going to conclude at 32. Now, for deploying VCF management services to get started, we require just a minimum of 12 IPs, right? But I need 12 contiguous IPs. That is what the UI asks for, right? And we do recommend 30, especially if you're going to take advantage of some of the new services. Some of these IPs are going to be used for patching and upgrade. It might be used for nodes that fail. As I scale up different services, right? I can add additional replicas. These nodes are going to get deployed. In other cases, I'm adding brand new features or new services into the VCF management services, right? So it's going to take advantage of this, right? So again, minimum of 12. Here's my starting block, but it's a continuous block of IPs is what the UI asks for by default. Now, on top of that, we also need 4 additional IP addresses. These addresses should be outside of the IP block. However, it does need to be part of that management network, right? And this is used for the API runtime. This is the underlying API endpoint that the VCF management services uses to go and scale and deploy all of these different services, right? So there's an FQN for that particular IP. We need another one for services that are scoped to the fleet aspect. And then some additional services that are going to be scoped down to the instance level of VCF. And then lastly, we have a dedicated FQDN for the identity broker, right? This is going to be used to go and talk to your external identity provider. So we want to make sure that we have a stable FQDN. And that's all we need to get started with, right? Now, with that said, these are defaults in the UI in terms of the allocation type. So one of the things you can do out of the box, right, is that if I don't have a continuous block of IPs, right, which is it's a critical piece of resource, right? We don't always have free IPs. I might have enough, but they might be spotty. I can actually use the APIs, right, to specify a different IP allocation methodology. So I can specify an IP list where I, as a user, instead of giving 12 contiguous IPs, I can actually request and say, these are the specific IPs I want you to use. And they might be throughout your network, and that's fully supported, right? Alternatively, you may just not have any more IPs on this management network, right? Especially if it wasn't sized for additional growth in the future, or things happen, we just don't have enough IPs. You do have the ability to again override the UI defaults using our APIs. You can now deploy this VCF management services on a completely different non-management network. Again, this could be a net new DVPG port group that you just created, or it just might just be another existing network that you already have provisioned that has spare capacity to meet these requirements, right? So a lot of options. UI does default to simplistic inputs, but we do have ways to override that capability. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and kind of take a look at some of the new fleet design that's available in 9.1 and sort of how do you get started and all the different implications that come about it. The first one's all about getting started in a most simplistic way, right? Which is our single fleet, single site design. And this optimizes for a single availability zone or a single region. And what you'll notice here is that all of the management components that we've talked about, they're going to be deployed in a singleton manner, right? Instead of an HA configuration. And in addition here, we're also combining both the management components as well as the workloads that you might run for your customers, right? And obviously, you want to take advantage of things like resource pools, which the product supports, to be able to make sure that you don't have a noisy native problem. But we fully support the ability to kind of mix and match these capabilities, right? Depending on the size of the environment and where it's being deployed, right? And in the past, this was kind of referred to as the consolidated architecture. But in 9.1, you really have choice in terms of where you want to run your workloads, right? And we'll talk about a design where these workloads are going to be separated out there, right? So very valid for a lot of customers. And the important fact to keep in mind is that in this model, you have both the ability to use VCF automation for that self-service consumption and exposing all those modern workloads, things like VKS, some of the data services, or I can go directly to vCenter server to get those same experience, right? One thing to understand is that VCF automation builds and consumes on top of vSphere Supervisor, which comes from vCenter server, right? And allows you to kind of pull together multiple environments together to provide that capacity. But if you just want to get started, you can start using vCenter directly, leveraging VKS and even some of the new capabilities that comes with things like VPCs and some of the transit gateway technologies that's available in 9.1. And then most importantly, this deployment fully supported in production, right? But it's really optimized for running the minimum amount of resource footprint, right? So this is great for something that for a lab or POC environment, but it's also great for just a small environment that you're just getting started with. And one of the things that you'll see is these different design can be mixed and match. You can grow from one design to another. And again, you can have different permutations, all dependent on your specific requirements and the specific environments that you're trying to consolidate or unify. The next design is exactly the same, right? We're still optimizing for a single availability zone, single region, but the key difference here is now all of the management components are now deployed in a highly available manner, right? So VCF management services, we talked about earlier, you'll have those 3 control plane nodes. VCF operations, we'll have 3 nodes for that. Same with VCF automation if you deploy that, etc. Furthermore, we're also separating out the workloads into its own dedicated workload domain. And one key difference here that I forgot to actually mention is that in earlier releases of VCF, when you deployed a workload domain, you would have a vCenter server, and you typically would deploy an NSX manager that go along with that infrastructure. In 9.1, I now have a choice of either having that separated out completely for some customers who have that requirement, or I can actually share that NSX manager from my management domain. So that is an additional capability that's there in 9.1. So that's why you see the dotted line there. And again, I get self-service consumption capabilities by using VCF automation, or I can go to vCenter server directly and get some of those more modern workloads capabilities. The next design is a single fleet with multiple sites within a single region. So again, I'm taking my workloads and I'm now distributing them across multiple availability zones, right? To ensure that we minimize any potential impact within a site. So I have my management domain going across availability zone 1 and 2. Same for my workload domains, right? And the way that we're leveraging this obviously from a compute storage standpoint is I have resources in both availability zone. From a storage standpoint, we are leveraging the vSAN stretch technology. You can also do this with external storage. Obviously, you want to talk to your external storage provider and follow the best practices for setting something up like this. And again, self-service capabilities, you're able to take advantage of all the modern workloads that's available to you. The next one is really a hybrid of the two, right? Now I have multiple sites across multiple regions. So I might have like a primary availability zone that's running my instance one. I have a disaster recovery site, right? Just providing additional business continuity or disaster recovery capabilities here, right? So again, it's taking a hybrid of the earlier scenarios that you saw. And then the last one is really a combining all these different designs into a hybrid model where I've got multiple availability zones, multiple regions, right? And this is really optimizing for a DR capability of our different management stack. Now, I know I quickly breezed through that. There's a lot more content, right? These are all included in these fleet designs. We started producing these as of 9.0. These have been completely refreshed. So if you go to the technical documentation on Broadcom's website, you click on the design tab, which is I think the third item down from the list, you're able to find all these different design blueprints that has all the different design decisions around things like availability, isolation, recoverability, right? So this is just a nice summary of the different designs that I just covered in terms of the initial deployment of your VCF 9.1 fleet. Now, on top of these fleet design blueprints that you've seen, we've also heard a lot of other requirements for other types of blueprints. And so 9.1, our team has actually shipped a whole number of different blueprints spanning across different designs, operational consumption. So let me quickly walk you through some of those. We also have optimized blueprints for edge, for those customers who need to deploy infrastructure and focusing on minimal set of resources, right, at these different locations. So we do have a blueprint focus on single node deployments, right, using Argo CD for modern application deployment, especially these days with AI workloads, running inference workloads at the edge. Definitely take a look at that. We also have edge-specific vertical use cases, right? Specific requirements for government and defense organizations, as well as manufacturing. So these are some additional blueprints that are available in 9.0 now. So go check those out as well. And then once you've deployed these blueprints, a big question that comes up typically is like, well, how do I operationalize VCF? How do I take advantage of these different capabilities? And this is something that we've been spending a lot of time on. And so you'll see a whole set of operational blueprints that not only takes you through these fleet management capabilities, all the different best practices. How do I bake in single sign-on? How do I take advantage of multiple identity providers, enabling things like multi-factor authentication, logging mechanisms? How do I scale that out from a monitoring, alerting, as well as troubleshooting standpoint? There's a whole set of new capabilities that's fully integrated into the VCF platform. Now you can start to leverage that. And how do you start to troubleshoot your particular workloads? Perimeter security is no longer sufficient. We also have a blueprint focus on some of that lateral security with VDefend and ATP, and how does that help you protect your infrastructure? And then we have a whole set of data protection and data recovery blueprints where you can now get best practices, guidance, as well as some automated tooling that the team has built around component backup and restore, instance level backup and restore, and then obviously fleet disaster recovery, as well as cyber recovery. So I know this is something that's been highly requested over the years to say, how do I operationalize this, right? To modernize my infrastructure now that I have VCF running, what are all the things that I can do? And what are some things that you've seen working with some of the largest customers out there that can benefit the broader community? And so we put together these operational blueprints. And then lastly is I've got these design blueprints. I know how to operationalize it, but many of you are still providing traditional ways of provisioning your workloads. You might be interested in terms of how do I take that to the next level? How do I even modernize just the way I deliver traditional workloads? And so we have a number of consumption blueprints that's focused on that, right? From a self-service aspect for both multi and single tenant and private cloud, I can now take those more traditional workloads and just up level that, make it simpler for my organization to deploy, provide some of those self-service day two capabilities, especially things like reconfiguring a virtual machine, maybe getting access to VM console. Those things take time and typically are requested through a self-service ticketing system. Now you can provide some of that out of the box using VCF automation. There's been a lot of talks around Kubernetes services, especially some of the things you can do within the ecosystem. So we have a number of blueprints that focuses on VKS and what are some of the best practices around delivering that service at enterprise scale. And then obviously lots of discussions around private AI. So we have a whole blueprint focus on some of the capabilities that come out of our private AI services, right? And if there are blueprints that you don't see here, things that you like to see from an operational standpoint or consumption standpoint, please share the feedback. Either reach out to me directly or share your thoughts within the Q&A. Our team would love to kind of hear from that, right? A lot of this is really based on feedback that we hear from you, our customers, even some of our partners as well, right? But you can see here, we have a whole lot of blueprints in terms of the initial fleet design, all the way to operating it and consuming it as well. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the fleet design consideration as you kind of start to think about how this might look within your infrastructure. And obviously, there are a couple of things that you want to think about. Obviously, scale, right? Not only scale of the different components, but sort of your ultimate comfort level in terms of the overall blast radius, right? That if you were to lose some infrastructure, what is that boundary that you're comfortable with from an SLA standpoint for your organization? Network connectivity, obviously, we're bringing together lots of different components, your disparate environments that's running. And historically, those have kind of run separately in each pocket. How do I bring all that together? And what are some things I need to think about there? And then, of course, there's always these non-technical requirements. I might have fleets for different functions. I might have a fleet that mirrors production. So I might have like a pre-production environment. I might have that are more functionally aligned to different lines of businesses. And in some cases, this might come organically through acquisitions where a customer might have an existing VCF environment. How do I bring that in and start to unify that and manage that as a unified platform? Or in some cases, I might divest infrastructure. And how do I start to have these different infrastructure components that might run separately from that? So from a fleet scale standpoint, we've increased the number of configurations and try to keep things simple, right? At a VCF fleet level, we support 50,000 ESX hosts. Now, one of the questions that typically comes up is, well, how many instances can I have? There is no maximum on instances, right? It's really going to vary on a number of factors. So we'll take a look at the next config maximum, which is the number of supported hosts under a single VCF instance, which is 5,000 hosts. So if you look at this number here, I could, in theory, have 10 VCF instances, right, that supports 5,000 hosts each to kind of hit that single fleet maximum. This is a 2x increase from 9.0, but of course you can have other variations from that depending on different configuration maximums you're trying to achieve. On a vCenter front, we still support 2,500 hosts per single vCenter server, which I believe is still plenty these days. I know some customers are spreading that out a little bit more, but if you need higher limits, definitely let us know. And then on the NSX front, because we're able to share that NSX manager from the management domain, we're able to increase that maximum to up to 5,000. So we have that additional flexibility. But again, all these numbers should be viewed on the configuration maximum site. But these are just some high-level numbers to kind of keep in mind as you think about your fleet design, whether you have a single fleet or you might have multiple fleets. On top of that, a big question is around connectivity, as we talked about earlier. This is something that we started in 9.0. Historically, we had all this information, but it was kind of buried in KB articles, documentation, and maybe in some of the architect's head. And so in 9.0, we started to publish this fleet latency diagram, and we've revised this for the 9.1 release. Obviously, there are new components such as the VCF management services, and there are different services within this component. So that's now been incorporated. You can take a look at the latest latency diagram and kind of understand, again, these are some other considerations, especially from a latency standpoint. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sushil, who's going to kind of take you through the different 9.1 pathways. Take it away, Sushil.
Thanks, William. Right. So everyone probably has a very good idea of the key architectural and design changes in 9.1. And now what we'll do is we'll talk about all of the different options you have in terms of upgrading from where you are to 9.1 and all of the different tools that we offer to make it easier for you to get there. So we are completely mindful that you might be coming from a different combination of either a vSphere deployment or a VCF deployment moving into 9. And what we want to do is we want to give you the flexibility to decide how you move from where you are to eventually where you need to get to. Now, we realize that there are always constraints when it comes to upgrading in terms of deploying all of the new components of VCF. And you might have maintenance windows, or you might have other reasons why you can't perform the entire upgrade at the same time. So we want to give you that flexibility to decide how you want to get to the next versions of 9, depending on where you're from. So as we move through this, the first thing to keep in mind as we go through this slide is that the key thing to look at is that the end of support for vSphere is coming October 2027. So with that in mind, we want you to have enough time to plan your upgrade for all of the different components that you have in your environment and in your ecosystem. So the way we've actually started building this out is depending on the current set of components that you have, we'll talk about what is the most expedient upgrade method for you and where do you go beyond that. So in terms of the very first option, let's say you have only a combination of vCenter ESX, vSAN, and ARIA operations. There is a method through which you can actually quickly move to 9.1 by just upgrading the individual components and doing the manual upgrade of the individual components to 9.1. Once you do that, the benefits that you will get are you get a chance to enable VKS for modern workloads, and you also can then add on NSX and for VPCs and fleet management. You can also add on VCFA, which gives you the flexibility of the modern consumption experience. You can also expand beyond VCF for more security features with vDefend and ACC. So that's the very first option on top. It's a manual upgrade. It's the fastest. If you want to quickly get the latest security fixes that are available in vCenter, ESX, and ARIA operations, you can actually go to that path. The second option is if you have NSX. So this is now additive in terms of where we move from one row to another. So if you have NSX in your environment, the option for you to upgrade all of these components is to use the installer to do a converge and import to 9.1. VCFA, once again, is there, but it's optional. You don't have to deploy it right away. You can take your time doing that. But it inherits all of the benefits from earlier, where you can still do VKS. Classic networking is fully supported. You can start deploying VPCs if you want to. And another key thing that actually comes in as part of this transition are all of the features around fleet management that William spoke about earlier. So this gives you centralized password management, certificate management, as well as lifecycle management. And you can start building towards the modern private cloud. And of course, in terms of the next steps, you can add VCFA to deploy the modern experience, and once again, choose to expand to vDefend or ACC for additional security or firewall requirements. However, if you do have ARIA automation in your environment, the path to move forward is to use the installer and do a converge and import to 9.1. That brings VCFA as well. And if you're using ARIA automation, you primarily are using the VM apps capability that existed in ARIA automation. VCF 9.1 brings in the newer version of ARIA automation, which is VCF automation 9.1. And that gives you the ability to also deploy the modern all apps component of VCF. And you can actually run these two side by side. So you can continue to use your VM apps. It's completely supported. And go ahead and also deploy all apps for the modern experience. They will be side by side. There's no migration at this point of time. But this gives you the overall full experience of what the modern private cloud is all about with VCF. So in terms of stepping stones for vSphere deployments, like I said, you can either go manual if you only have vCenter, ESX, and ARIA, and then you can expand into fleet management by doing the converge and import, and then deploy VCFA. We want you to get there as quickly as possible, but we also want you to plan it out in a way that you can move through different stages of the upgrade at your pace, depending on whatever other constraints you have. So the final option here is if you already have VCF, it's either version 5 or version 9, you do a standard upgrade using the SCDC manager. And if you have ARIA automation already, then it continues to work just as is. You can deploy and add all apps if you want to. And in all of these different versions from top to bottom, you can deploy VKS for modern workloads. So we want to make sure that you have the ability of ensuring that you do the step-by-step upgrade if you need to, or you can just jump into all of the full stack components as well. We leave that flexibility all the way to you. And that's one of the key things that we have done to make this a lot more easier in VCF 9. So the tool I spoke about is that we've created an upgrade planner tool that lets you enter different combinations of components you're coming from, and it automatically curates the actual pathway to where you need to go to. So this usually used to be only for VCF, but we've recently also added VVF as a destination. So depending on exactly what components you have in your environment, you can select them in the tool, and the tool interactively tells you what is the best prescribed path for you to do an upgrade in the exact sequence that lets you move from one stage to another. It also gives you links to the actual documentation that we have with VCF, and also helps you export the plan. The entire tool has been quite popular. You can also refer to it on William's blog because he's had it out there for a while now. And in a reasonably short amount of time, we already have over 20K visitors that have been to this tool. So something that we highly recommend in terms of trying to make your upgrade experience a lot easier, a lot smoother, and help you plan effectively and accordingly. All right, so now let's take a look at the key takeaways of the entire session that we just had. The very first thing that we spoke about is that there are new design elements that were introduced as in VCF 9. They continue on with VCF 9.1, and we have a set of curated blueprints that we've created that help you not just with your day zero deployment of your infrastructure, but also gives you guidance and design recommendations for operational and consumption use cases that you have. And the entire set of blueprints are available as part of the VCF documentation. The second thing that we spoke about was the specific building blocks for new deployments. So we want to give you flexibility both in terms of deploying, whether it's a brand new deployment or it's an upgrade. So when William spoke about the different fleet designs that we have that take into account different options of availability and disaster recovery, you can always start with a simple design, which is the building block, and then you can mix and match the designs and keep building as and when you need it. And the final thing that we kind of spoke about were the flexible upgrade paths. So what we want you to know is there is a different upgrade path that kind of helps and meets you where you are and takes you through the journey of VCF. It gives you flexibility in terms of how you want to build through the entire structure of modern private cloud, and then takes you all the way in terms of a curated fashion. And we also have a tool that helps you with that. So since we're right on time, I want to say thank you all for attending the session. We hope that this was very informative and you got a whole lot of new information here about VCF 9. It's very flexible in terms of how you want to deploy it, how you want to upgrade, and how you want to start consuming it. So we thank you for your time. The majority of us will be delivering sessions at Explore. So hopefully we see you there, and hope you all are enjoying the World Cup. And thank you for attending.